This is the third of the meetings looking at the Mayor's draft budget for the municipal year 2018-19. And this afternoon we're going to be speaking to the London Fire Brigade and the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority. Item 1 is apologies for absence. Haven't received any. Obviously we knew that Assemblyman Prince was here this morning, so I think he's probably just on his way down. Item 2 is the declarations of interest. The committee is recommended to note and list the offices held by Assembly members. Are there any other declarations that people wish to make at this time? Thank you. Item 3, the main item of business for this afternoon, is the draft GLA budget for 2018-19 as it pertains to the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority. And I'd like to welcome our guests this afternoon. From left to right, as I'm looking at it anyway, Sue Budden, the Director of Finance and Contractual Services at the LFEPA. The Commissioner, Dany is unfortunately unwell today and is unable to attend, so she's asked Steve Apter to attend in her stead, so we're going to be in good hands. Fiona Twycross, AM, the Chair of the Fire Authority, and David Gallie, who is ever present at these meetings, as we know, and you can tell by looking at him, he's done a few already. So, I believe, Chair, that the Commissioner wished to have a statement read at the beginning, which, Steve, you're going to do.
Thank you very much, Chair. On behalf of the Commissioner, when I sat here this time last year, it was my 4th day in the job. I had a list of things I wanted to do and an idea of how I was going to prioritise them. What actually happened, as you all know, was quite a different story. 4 terrorist attacks, the critical threat level raised twice, and our worst fire since the Second World War. These terrible incidents have affected all of us at LFB, and the Grenfell Tower fire will continue to have an impact and dominate our work for a long time to come. In terms of looking back at 2017, it's also important to me that we recognise our achievements across the brigade over the last year. To help keep Londoners safe and to deliver the best possible service, these are some of the things we did in 2017. The London Safety Plan was approved at the authority in March, which focused on increasing terrorism response capabilities, expanding the role of our firefighters, and placing fire stations at the heart of our communities. Our new Community Safety Investment Fund saw £2 million awarded across London's 33 boroughs to help protect the capital's most vulnerable residents. We stepped up our Total Recalls campaign, which calls for improvement in the safety of white goods in people's homes. And in February, following 6 months of campaigning, White Goods giant Whirlpool changed its advice and told consumers to unplug dangerous, faulty tumble dryers, something they had previously refused to do. We've represented the National Fire Chiefs Council on a government working group, and we are expecting policy announcements in the near future. Our Fire, Safe and Well pilot got underway in 5 boroughs, where we work with partners to provide a joined-up service to improve the safety and well-being of local communities. We launched a new campaign called Firefighting Sexism to ask the nation to stop using the outdated term fireman as part of a drive to encourage more women to become firefighters. We took part in a multi-agency exercise in November to help the public and business owners understand the dangers of an acid attack in their premises. And the Blue Light Collaboration Programme sets out how we work with the Metropolitan Police and London Ambulance Service to make London the safest global city. And in November, we hosted a very high-profile demonstration day on the river and at Lambeth Fire Station to showcase this work in action. In terms of resources, the events of last year have also seen increased pressures on our budgets. For example, our inspecting officers carried out 520 inspections on general fire precautions in buildings with ACM cladding over the summer. 188 buildings within London failed testing set out in DCLG guidance, which is more than the total number of cases in the rest of the country together. These premises were subsequently revisited by LFB's inspecting officers as part of a second phase of inspections. As you will know, following the Grenfell fire and the terrorist incidents, the Mayor asked me to undertake an urgent review of additional specialist equipment and support needed to keep Londoners safe. An initial assessment indicated LFB needed £6 million worth of new equipment and an additional £6 million a year in running costs to operate that equipment. Resources Committee agreed in July for £6.8 million to be transferred into an earmarked reserve to temporarily fund a number of resource requirements, and we've been getting on with that procurement. Overall, with the Mayor's consultation budget now released, LFEPA has a balanced budget over the 4-year planning period. The budget gap over the planning period had stood at 20 million. It's now reduced to 1 million, with nearly £8 million remaining in the budget flexibility reserve. I really welcome this additional funding, as it would not be possible to achieve a £20 million saving without making significant changes to our frontline service. Increasing our funding now means we're able to build up funding over the next few years so we can avoid this. This is especially important given the unprecedented events of last year. There still remains, however, more for the Brigade to do to manage risks and uncertainties, as set out within our budget report, which of course include the ongoing national pay negotiations. We will also continue to look for efficiencies and better ways of working as part of our annual budget process. And in terms of a look ahead, looking ahead to this year, a lot of our work will focus on the criminal investigation and the public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire. We also continue our campaigning on sprinklers, building regulations and total recalls to make London safer. We should also see the abolition of LFEPA on 1st of April. Operational staff should get their new personal protective equipment in October, and work on implementing changes to our watch structure continues. We'll see further developments in our Safer Together and putting people first strategies and the launch of our new public website. And the Commissioner asked me to pass on sincere apologies for not being able to be here herself today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. It's a very useful opening statement. There's a number of issues in there that we will explore in some depth as we go through the meeting. The opening question I would make, which really I think all of you could answer, I'll probably start with Sue. I think Steve and Fiona would be useful input to this, is what difficult decisions you had to make in putting together your budget submission for 2018-19. Probably start with you, Sue.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's fair to say that doing the budget submission gets harder each year. We've made around £130 million worth of savings since 2010, so it becomes harder and harder to find easy things to save. The most significant issue in the current submission was the budget gap in the later 2 years. So you probably know from last year that we took a decision to bring savings forward in our 17-18 budget so we could create this budget flexibility reserve that would give us headroom to think about how we plan for the future. And we supported that with the London Safety Plan, which got agreed in March of last year now. So that set out all our priorities and included plans to investigate different ways of working. But then, as Dany, as read by Steve in the opening statement, has explained, we've had some unprecedented incidences this year, which has meant we've had to revisit what those plans might look like. And that, coupled with the additional resilience requirements that we identified in July, means that we weren't able to identify savings at this stage that would close that budget gap into the future. So the difficult decision wasn't in the submission for 18-19, how to balance that budget, but it was what can we say about the total 4-year period. Okay, that's fair.
Steve or Fiona, do you want to add to that?
I think for obvious reasons, Grenfell was a game changer, and it really did put new pressures on the Brigade's resources, sort of not just in the additional resources and equipment we required, but also in the ways that we were going to explore closing the budget gap through the London Safety Plan that aren't really an option to explore any more. So some of the flexible ways of working that we were going to put pilots in to try and close the budget gaps aren't really palatable post Grenfell. So I think that was the really difficult part of the context. And as Sue Budden has outlined, this wasn't going to be a difficult year initially, but I think some of those additional pressures that we've experienced had made it a much harder process than we'd initially imagined the 4-year cycle.
Thank you. Steve, anything you want to add?
From an operational perspective, it was the London Safety Plan set out those medium and longer term plans and some of the challenges from the lessons learned from the terrorist attacks, our response to that, and looking at a changing threat level meant that we had to take a new look at our resilience arrangements.
Okay. Sue, the Mayor's decision on council tax, fairly easy answer really. How has it changed your approach to setting the budget this time?
So it provides additional funding for 18-19 of a little under £4.5 million, but that increases on the assumption that the council tax increases over the next 4 years to just under 19 million by 21-22. So in effect, we can now present a balanced budget for the 4 years. We also have the opportunity in the first couple of years, or certainly the first year, to build up funding in the budget flexibility reserve. So that will be the third year that we've had the opportunity to do that. So that will leave us funding to help us manage risks as they materialise. The budget submission that we put through in November had a whole range of unquantified risks attached to the budget. One of the most significant of those will be the ongoing national pay negotiations. We've only budgeted for the 2% that's been discussed for 17-18. We haven't budgeted beyond that at the current moment. So it obviously completely changes the picture compared to what we presented in November, but gives us flexibility and also certainty over the next 4 years.
Okay, this is to the Chair of the Authority. Anthony Mayer conducted a review commissioned by the Mayor at the outset of the Mayor's tenure, shortly after he was elected, which concluded that the London Finance Commissioner, which is what we're calling LFC from now on, didn't need any more council tax funding. So why has the Mayor put more council tax funding into the fire brigade this time?
I think one of the things that Anthony Mayer was clear about was that there shouldn't be additional reductions to the fire brigade budget. So it wasn't simply that...
That's not quite right, is it?
I think so. He was quite clear that the...
What he actually said, and I'll quote you the recommendation, there is currently no persuasive case to increase LFB's budget by diverting resources from elsewhere in the GLA group or increasing the precept. Perhaps more importantly, there should be no additional reductions to LFB's budget that would worsen the £23.5 million budget gap inherited from Mayor Johnson. The fire station closures, reductions in fire appliances and cuts to firefighter numbers introduced by LSP 5 should be embedded by the LFB.
I think we're effectively coming at it from slightly different angles, because I think when he said there shouldn't be any additional reductions to the fire brigade's budget, he wasn't talking in a context in which it was clear what was going to happen over the coming year. So I think Anthony Mayer's report was published. We've then had a year in which we've had unprecedented pressures on the fire brigade, both in terms of the terror attacks and then in the context of the Grenfell fire, all of which weren't envisaged at the time, and actually all of which weren't included in our thinking around LSP, the latest London safety plan. So I think that if you're looking at not having additional reductions in a budget, when you start getting additional pressures on a budget, then I think the subsequent recommendation, which was around the LFB and MLT continue to monitor performance and be ready to mitigate any unacceptable negative impacts and to address any changes in demand, also come into play. So if we're no longer able to explore the pilots around flexible working, such as day crewing or as sort of alternate crewing of the fire and rescue units, which I think the public would find unacceptable post-Grenfell, as I think members of the Fire Authority would also be concerned about reductions. I think recommendation 2 from Anthony Mayer makes it clear that actually it's not that in any context we've got sufficient resources. You actually need to sort of continue to monitor that on an ongoing basis. And I think what you've seen with the proposed rise in council tax is the Mayor actually sort of anticipating a future need and actually showing the foresight to make sure that in 2 or 3 years' time we don't see the level of cuts to fire stations and firefighter numbers that we saw under previous London safety plans. So I think it's an incorrect reading of Anthony Mayer's conclusions to see that as an indication that the council tax increase isn't necessary in this context in terms of protecting the fire brigade.
The council tax increase that is being proposed for this year is going to lead to an increase in the level of reserves for 2018-19. Do you think it's acceptable for Londoners to pay a higher level of council tax so that LFEPA can increase its reserves?
The reserves aren't simply reserves just for the fire brigade to sit on reserves and sort of build up reserves that aren't allocated or sort of specifically for something that's very much needed. It is about sort of building up reserves against the budget hole in future years. And I think actually I would think that Londoners would welcome the fact that the Mayor's looking forward to making sure that he's looking ahead to make sure that the budget gap is met, because I don't think Londoners have an appetite for more cuts to the fire brigade in future years.
But nobody's talking about making more cuts to the fire brigade in future years, are they? And the context is that we have a mayor who has incessantly said for at least a year that the police service is under-resourced and has made that case to government a lot with a considerable degree of cross-party support. And the extra funding that the government has allowed him to raise through council tax doesn't close the gap completely. Now, in that context, do you think that it's a good idea for council taxpayers to be paying in this forthcoming year to top up LFEPA's reserves when there is still a gap in police funding?
I think that it's two different things you're talking about in the same sentence, and I think that in terms of fire, which is obviously the issue we're specifically talking about today, I think building up reserves in order to avoid cuts, and I think the Commissioner herself has been very clear that if we didn't find ways of meeting the budget gap in 2 years' time, then we would be seeing cuts of the scale of the 5th London Safety Plan. And I think that that's specifically what the element of council tax funding relating to fire would help address. And I think that Londoners on the whole would be quite supportive of the idea of not having future cuts to the fire service of that level.
I think I would have more faith in that answer if that case had been made during the process of LSP 2017. Now, I accept what you say, that Grenfell occurred after that, but the £23.5 million funding gap to the end of the mayoral term was known about before the mayoral term began. Now, if we are saying that to close that gap, there would have to be a rearrangement of the front line, then why did LSP 2017 not cover that?
LSP 2017 did cover that. We were going to look at pilots, which
but there was no case made for future funding.
Well, I think that we were going to look at pilots, including, I mean, Sue or Steve might have more detail on this, but we were going to have pilots specifically exploring ways of making those savings, including day crewing and alternate crewing. Now, we haven't had the opportunity to undertake those pilots. I would suggest that in the post-Grenfell context, those pilots wouldn't really be acceptable in terms of having day crewing in central London or alternate crewing of vehicles that were used to their maximum capacity under the most severe fire we've seen since the Second World War. And I think that we were exploring, as part of the London Safety Plan 2017, ways of meeting that budget gap. We didn't actually have ways of meeting that, but we were looking at ways that we could do that, and actually we had quite a few ideas within the framework of how we could do that, including the day crewing and alternate crewing, both of which could have potentially made quite significant savings.
Yeah, but the issue remains, though, that if it is crucial to close that 23.5 funding gap without making a major realignment of frontline services, then that case could and should perhaps have been made during LSP 2017, and it wasn't.
I think we can talk round in circles on this, but Grenfell genuinely was a game changer, and I think that not being able to explore additional ways of making those savings really took an opportunity off the table that is now no longer available for us to explore options that simply wouldn't be palatable to the general public, and also wouldn't probably be palatable to politicians sitting around this table.
How do you know if you haven't run the pilot?
I think running a pilot on day crewing in the context of having had a monumental, unprecedented fire which employed huge resources from London, and in order to make sure we had sufficient cover in other parts of the city, employed mutual aid from other parts of the country in terms of the significant mutual aid we received from outside London. I don't think that day crewing would be palatable, and I think that at some point when you face significant change in what the anticipated threat level would be, I don't think the point at which we're still seeing issues with ACM cladding on buildings in London is the point to start exploring controversial ways of crewing in the current context. So in that context, the looking to council tax as a way of addressing the budget issues, I'm confident would receive greater public support.
The Budget Flexibility Reserve, which has been built up to smooth the process of finding efficiencies over the next few years, meant that for the next 2 financial years, notwithstanding the council tax proposals this year, you would have had a 2-year window, wouldn't you, to find savings to close that gap. Is that right, Sue? Okay. How do you build up the Budget Flexibility Reserve from 0 to 11.5 million in 12 months?
So almost well over half of it was a deliberate decision taken as part of the setting the budget for 17-18. So we worked to identify savings that we could bring forward. We had a gap of about 1.3 million for the current year, but we found savings in excess of 7 million explicitly to say we're going to set that money aside. So that put 6.2 million into the reserve as an explicit part of the decision last year. And then we've had underspends this year. A further 5.43 million is currently forecast. So that would go into the reserve as well. And the main sources of underspending for that have been around staff vacancies, the usual additional income under the Metropolitan Fire Brigade Act, and we've also had some pension cost savings as the cost of the new schemes goes down.
How often in the last 5 years has the Fire Brigade underspent its budget?
I've been here longer than 5 years. We've underspent.
Say that again, sorry?
I've been here longer than 5 years, and we've underspent for varying reasons during that time.
Okay, every year?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Roughly how much money over that time has the LFB underspent by? What I'm getting at, I'm not trying to trip you over, I'm trying to find out how predictable the underspend is.
So I don't think that putting a number against it necessarily demonstrates its predictability. So they've been linked to different reasons. So we have an issue at the moment around vacancies. So we have underspends last year and the current year around vacancies. But in previous years, we've had underspends as a result of changes in the way the firefighters' pension scheme was managed. We've had additional income. So we've had a range of reasons why we've underspent. Every year, we do a detailed process with departmental heads going around and saying, right, you didn't spend that money, why didn't you spend that money? And can we do something structurally different to the way that we budget in order to address that? And we've done that with the vacancies, both in the current year and are proposing to do that for next year, where we look at what we call our vacancy margin. So we say we know now we won't have potentially this many people on average over the year, so we'll adjust for it. So we have an ongoing process of trying to identify. I don't think we've got structural underspends that means there is permanent money to take out that I've not identified, but I think there's been causes year on year that we do always reflect on.
Okay. I mean, that's an area I know that has been tightened from personal experience over the years. The vacancy margin that you're budgeting for this year is 5.3 million when you normally plan for 1.6. Why is that?
So, which probably ties into the last point, really. So firefighters on a week's notice. They mainly go when they can retire after their 30 years service. There was the new pension scheme require them as the transition periods go through to work for longer than that. So the 1.6 million is an assumption of an average vacancy of about 38 during the year. Given what we know about the current year and looking forward to forecasting as best as we can, given that really short notice period, we've assumed that there'll be somewhere around 123, 125 vacancies on average next year. So it's for that reason that we've put the vacancy margin up, which is a way of saving money now on a one-off rather than underspending next year. One of the things we're keen to do with all of this process is make sure that we don't set a budget for things that we don't need. So that will be one of the reasons for putting the vacancy margin in now rather than just underspending next year.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Now, one of the major costs that you always face is future pension costs. I believe we're budgeting for an extra £500,000 next year. What is the total potential pension scheme costs that you're facing, and how have you estimated them?
Well, this is one of our unknown areas, so we've done a lot of work ourselves to try and put a price on it. So the Government Actuaries Department does its triennial valuation of the Firefighters Pension Scheme, and they've already completed that work as at March 16, but they haven't yet told us what that is going to mean to the employer's contribution. So we've made our own assumptions based on 3 elements. So I think it was in the March 16 budget the Chancellor said they were going to change the discount rate, so that's increased. And we've only got headline statements. So that says that will increase the employer's contribution across the public sector by around £2 billion. So we said our proportion of that would be around 5 million. We've also have to take, we think, on board the fact that retained firefighters now have access to the pension scheme. So this was something that was debated a few years ago that you might remember from your time as chair. Retained firefighters now have access. We said all along, we've never had any retained firefighters. Why should we pick up the cost of giving them that access and giving them their past service costs? But the statement is that it applies across the National Fire Service and you pick up your share, so that's nearly £1 million. And then a couple of years ago, when we first could see how the new pension scheme was cheaper, our grant settlement was reduced between the provisional in December and the final in January by about 400 grand to take account of that. We now know that the pension scheme is around £2.8 million cheaper, so we're assuming our grant will be reduced to take into account of that, but that hasn't happened yet. So we're assuming the actuarial evaluation will pick up those 3 things.
When are you expecting that to happen?
£9 million. Well, now we're told that we'll know the outcome of the actuarial evaluation by April 18. So it'll be after we set the final budget in March.
So April 18. So are we talking about it would impact on this coming financial year?
No, 1920.
Right, so you have at least one more year and then... Okay. Okay, I've seen Assembly Members Cooper and Prince in that order, so Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to the issue of the impacts between the finalising of LSP 17 and then the subsequent Grenfell fire and the terror incidents and the impact on staffing. Obviously, there's the increase in council tax, but there's also a decrease to a certain degree in the business rate income coming in, but overall an increase in the budget. How much of that increase in the revenue budget, just focusing strictly on the revenue budget at this point, will go towards some of the potential additional responsibilities, some of which have been identified now and have been exercised already by the brigade in terms of inspections, particularly of buildings over 10 stories, buildings without sprinklers, you know, leading to the evacuations in Camden and having 24/7 waking people marching up and down in corridors that I'm familiar with in a couple of blocks in my constituency, through to whether we've got any idea of what the implications might be from the Grenfell inquiry in terms of requirements in subsequent years of this budget. And perhaps I could point that towards Steve and then anyone else who wants to add to that. So I was conscious in your initial remarks you did talk about some of the additional work that had been undertaken.
Thank you. I'll kind of take that in reverse if I may.
Sure.
Some of the activity, it's quite interesting. The question leads, and a lot of the debate has been primarily around the response, operational response, understandably so. But the activity that's increased around our wider prevention and protection activity has been quite phenomenal. And certainly, I think it would be remiss of me at this moment not to recognise the teams within London, because they are recognised nationally for the work that they continue to do. But what it has identified, there's a phrase we use which is, you know, we now know more risk than we knew previously, and our job is to manage and mitigate that risk. So the extra resource, a lot of extra resource we put into the inspection teams, there are a number of challenges for us as a service. Those skill sets don't just sit idle waiting around. It's a really high demand, low supply skill set. So we're working really hard to how do we develop the skills in-house in a variety of ways, but buying that in. So resourcing around that has been a real challenge, continues to be, as we see significant issues starting to emerge. I think in terms of some of the areas we've looked at, and I'll refer to Sue in terms of some of the specifics on the finances, they're in 3 levels really. You've got the operational requirement, to remain flexible against a changing risk. So you'll be aware of some of the requirements that the Commissioner put forward around how do we look at the emerging technology and new technologies, which we'd already identified within LSP 17 that we would look at.
Well, we'll come back
Apologies.
to equipment later. I wanted to focus on the issues around people, and you've pulled out of my concern there already the issue about the skill sets for the competent people to actually go and do those fire inspections, because actually that was something that the brigade used to be much more involved in. It may come back to the brigade as a higher as a requirement in the future again.
I think obviously in terms of Grenfell, we're more than aware we're subject to the limitations as a public inquiry and criminal investigation. So I wouldn't second guess what the outcomes might be. However, I think you've made reference to the regulations, which we know Dame Judy Hackett has already fed back on. So we are already, and the team certainly are already looking at what might the future look like. But that's where we are at the moment. It's what might the future look like as a result of the outcomes of the inquiry and the criminal investigation. So certainly on the people front, we are looking at the operational resilience of the organisation. We're looking at our response to a changing threat around terrorism. We have to be as flexible and adaptable with our response as the threat is. That's creating some challenges for us in terms of how do we make sure we've got the right people with the right skills in the right place. And then we've got that wider prevention, and in terms of engagement and community engagement, how we can resource that for a future risk. So from my perspective, and certainly on behalf of the Commissioner, they've been really part of our priority set.
I mean, one of the things that's been a big issue in my backyard, and I'm sure it's the same for other Assembly members, has been the whole thing about, if there are not sprinklers currently fitted, how can that risk that has now been, as you very clearly stated, been identified, how can it be managed and mitigated? And there are some things that have been put in place to do that, including obviously evacuation, but in many cases local authorities have been on, that's actually quite a sort of nuclear option, if you like. So they've put in place some other arrangements. Those aren't necessarily things that can go on long term, but presumably there's still an ongoing involvement of staff in needing to go back and inspect those interim arrangements. I mean, that must be an extra call on the staff time, plus also the need for potential training to make sure you've got enough people to get out there and do those inspections while those arguments or discussions take place about not just do we need sprinklers, at what height block do we put sprinklers in, does it if it's got two staircases, can we do without, and who's going to pay for it being the underlying issue.
So when we came up with our additional resilience requirements in July, we put in funding, £1.5 million for additional fire safety inspecting officers, nearly £500,000 for training. So there were a whole range of things that we costed out.
So it has had an impact on this year's expenditure. And are you going to foresee that is likely to go forward then?
So that's money that we're building in permanently as part of this budget submission. And then in terms of what the inquiry brings and the Hackett review, they would be risks for the future. I think if the requirements on the brigade changed, I'm probably being naive, but you'd assume it would potentially come with additional burdens funding. We would certainly try for that. But.
Could I just clarify one point? Sorry to interrupt. What you talked about there, your submission in July, that's for the forthcoming budget round, isn't it? It's not an in-year change.
No, this was, the report that we did in July, where we asked to set up a reserve to start now and to build it in as part of our budget submission. So
okay, so it wasn't an in-year change, it was a plan for the forthcoming financial year. Okay, fine. So
it's come out of reserves for this year and been so that was £3 million you were saying for the inspections and then also the training, and that you've then put that in as an ongoing £3 million. But if there are any changes to regulations as a result of what comes out of the various Grenfell inquiries, then it may or is quite likely to go up in terms of if there are additional responsibilities placed on the brigade. Okay, thank you, Chair. I think that's covered what I wanted to find out.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. I just want to touch on this. I'll come back to it under the capital aspect, but Fiona, if I can just get that right, you're saying, I was looking at the budget as well, you're saying that the build-up of reserves is in order to pay off shortfall in revenue going forward. Is that what you said?
Yes, it was something that the authority agreed to last year. So basically we were front-loading cuts in order to build up reserves to make sure that we didn't have such a large budget gap going forward that would have required significant cuts, and that was where we were going to be looking for different ways of working to try and meet some of that shortfall.
It's just the principle of using capital, well, reserves, if you like, to fund revenue, because obviously you at some point you run out of reserves, don't you?
It's not a capital reserve,
I don't think it's
revenue
capital
reserve.
reserves.
So I corrected myself and
Yeah.
said reserves, yeah. But at some point, if you're using reserves to fund a revenue stream, at some point you run out of reserves, don't you?
Assembly Member Prince, just to be helpful, it's the Budget Flexibility Reserve, which was set up specifically for that purpose, so that the Fire Brigade could smooth the savings programme over a period of years rather than face a cliff edge. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I'd say that was.
I'm happy with the answer they gave, anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, we're going to move on and talk about Grenfell, and Assembly Member Cooper is going to lead on that for us.
Thank you. So now moving to the more on the capital side, and also the potential for support that you might get for that. I wondered, perhaps if Steve could talk us through this, could you talk us through the review of specialist equipment that was conducted as a result of the Grenfell fire, and if you could also, set out for us, what the consequences of that are at this point for the budget for next year.
You'll be aware the Commissioner was asked to undertake a review fairly swiftly after the Grenfell Tower fire. A number of things I've mentioned before: understanding and knowing risk, and building in flexibility to be able to mitigate and meet that risk. The equipment requirement that we undertook a review immediately afterwards identified three key areas really. One was the extended height aerial appliances, and if I can just for a moment expand on that. The technology has moved on since, as I've made reference earlier on, since London had its fleet procured. So we can now have extended height aerial appliances on a similar chassis size that we currently have. Because obviously our road, we've got some limitations with some of the equipment we were offered very helpfully during Grenfell. But those extended height appliances have a far wider ranging use, operational use, from rescue platforms to firefighting platforms, observation platforms. They can lift. So it's a really wide-ranging use of equipment, and they give us a wider resilience for a wider operational risk base.
And so, how high do they actually go?
Next week we've got some of the team having a look at some of the technology that's out there, because since my days as an aerial instructor, which was scary enough, I can believe you me, they're even higher now. So the aerial appliances around the world are particularly high. I think that some of the ones that we are currently looking at can reach up to 22, 23 floors in high rise. So they are considerably extended in their capabilities than currently. So we're looking at the market all the time. What provides the operationally most effective and most efficient equipment for London. Another area that is used quite a lot now, and certainly was used to great extent in partnership with our colleagues from Kent Fire Service, are drones, and we've been exploring the use of drones for some time. And again, a piece of equipment that can offer us a really wide-ranging suite of benefits. Our colleagues in the police and other services use drones as a matter of operational course now. We need to learn from those, so we're looking at reviewing how we can use drones in a wider, not just giving us an observation and raising our situational awareness, but also in terms of being able to highlight some risk areas so we can help make firefighters as safe as we possibly can and improve our operational response. And we recognise there's so many different applications for this technology, and it's moving on all the time. So we're keen, again, that we get the best for our needs. For example, at Grenfell, the drones were actually used with a piece of equipment. They were monitoring the stabilisation of the building for us. So they would go up, measure the position of the building to within millimetres, and we would send those drones up regularly to help us with that. The third strand in terms of equipment is the extended duration breathing apparatus sets. So again, the technology has moved on. Our current breathing apparatus sets have a working duration of around 31 minutes, depending on how hard people are working, as I'm sure you can imagine. And the extended duration sets have a working duration of 45 minutes. So again, we've got the project underway, and Grenfell utilised our entire stocks of extended duration breathing apparatus sets. So the project is on that we will look to have an extended breathing apparatus sets on all frontline appliances. I think added to that, we've touched on certainly the inspection requirement. All of those pieces of kit bring with them, as you've rightly identified, a training implication and an ongoing maintenance and training implication. But we've also increased our counselling and wellbeing service. Grenfell in particular highlighted the challenges of managing, and as you will be more than aware, it was a real priority from very early on of the Commissioner. And the third strand on that was we've increased the establishment of our senior commander rota at the Deputy Assistant Commissioner level to improve the officer resilience, which was a challenge. So across all those areas, that was the outcome of the initial review in terms of the needs, and in terms of the budget requirement that's been identified and captured within the budget proposal.
And have you, thank you very much for that, that's very clear for us all. Have you revisited the costs? Because I think the capital costs that were initially outlined for us were for the aerial appliances and the extended BAs, which came to 5.2 million. I don't have a cost for the drones,
Sure.
and could you just confirm whether or not those costs, for those capital costs, have been revisited, and also what the cost for the additional training, so that all of these fresh items can be used, and also any additional costs for the counselling service, which I think is very, very welcome. You know, we've been very bad in the past about dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and just saying to people, pull themselves together, and it's very welcome, I think, that nobody's saying firefighters are not brave, but to actually say that you can be brave but still need counselling is, I think, a very welcome step forward. But have you reviewed these costs?
Yes, so those costs were indicative, and I mentioned earlier on, we've got some of our specialist team looking out at the market. So as we narrow that down through the procurement process, and the scoping exercise takes place, and with specification, certainly I can give assurance that those costs won't increase. So we're now able to narrow down, so really focus down to detailing the costs as we've got the specifications and the procurement process in place.
And is there going to be some sort of ring fence on the budget for these items and for the training and the counselling to make sure that we do get these things in place?
We don't ring fence budgets. They are budgeted items, and they will be delivered. We don't ring fence.
Okay, but we are definitely going to be purchasing them and making sure that that counselling and also the additional training takes place.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question from me, and then I'm going to throw it open to a couple of other members that I've seen. The stated capital cost for the extended height aerial appliances is 2.4 million. Is that having taken into account the donation that has been offered to the LFB to fund 2 of those?
So we've got a total allocation for 15 aerials, 5 of which will be extended height. So we had money for 15 normal aerials. Now we've got money from the conversation Steve's just been having for 3 of the extended height, and then the donation is for a further 2.
Okay, fine. Actually, that does accord with something I think I was told a little while ago, so thank you for not being rude enough to point that out. Okay, Assembly Members Berry and then Pigeon.
I think this is a question for Fiona as it relates to the emergency planning and London resilience team budget line that's in the budget. That's flat. That's been flat forever as far as I can tell, looking back at previous budgets as well. It's 1.1 million every year and doesn't even seem to have inflation attached to it. The Assembly Oversight Committee, we've been talking to the London resilience team, and I mean, quite potentially, they might need more money in future to plan better for civil emergencies and things like that. So can I ask about that in general? Are you looking at potentially adding more money into that in future? Is a review going on? Is there anything you know about future plans being made? Obviously, the Oversight Committee hasn't made any recommendations yet. So.
I think we'd be interested to look at the recommendations made by the Oversight Committee. I think the resilience team were asked as part of the review of resources after Grenfell whether they had sufficient resources. So as part of Dany's review of what resources the brigade needed, they were in that, included in that conversation. So I think that's reflected in the budget. Those conversations that were had, that actually one of the ways they're looking at more resilience is actually sort of making sure that that team is made up of a sort of more broad aged profile. So basically not just seeing some of these jobs as things that people do when they come off the front line, but actually seeing the type of resilience job, or actually the inspection jobs, as something that people do for a career, which is part of the sort of building up the resilience over time, which is something that I know Steve Ham and his team have been looking at in the same way that the inspection team, because I think traditionally some of these roles have been sort of things that people have done when they're no longer on the front line, and actually that's not sustainable for any brigade, and it's something that we want to make sure that people have got that sort of organisational resilience, there's a sort of more diverse age profile as well as sort of general diversity.
I think I've seen somewhere that more senior council officers, because they take up these roles in emergencies, are being trained as well. So I mean, that's why I'm surprised that the budget is so flat for this, and even that it doesn't inflate. Is there any explanation for that?
So have you got any explanation about that specifically?
I think that might be presentational, the inflation point, but I'd probably have to check that and come back to you. I'm just looking at this breakdown of the best value portion, which I think maybe is where you've taken that from, and I don't know how inflation has been applied across those lines. So.
I suspect it may just be in the roundings, where we essentially round on page 30 of the table you're referring to, Sean. We generally round to the nearest 100,000, so it may well be it's just the rounding error there. And
okay, I've looked back and it's never switched from that one decimal point, so you'd think it would at some point. Yeah.
In the normal way, we'll write to you afterwards, and perhaps we can sweep this up at that point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Member Budget.
Yeah. When are you expecting this new specialist equipment to arrive, be on stream, available for use?
So in terms of specifics, the project team of the procurement process is now in full swing. In terms of specification, like everybody else, the supply chains, it's a really niche market.
Yes,
it's a very niche global market, so the supply chains are somewhat limited. At this point in time, I couldn't give a definitive answer because we're still in that specification stage. But again, once again, we'll be able to get that information through once we
have an idea of which year you'd anticipate delivery.
So in terms of the drones in the shorter term, certainly because it's a relatively easier procurement process. So we're certainly I'm looking at that for in 18-19. The extended height appliances. So have you got any idea on
between 18-19 and 19-20, so potentially the back end of the next financial year or into the one afterwards.
So in your budgets for those years, are you having to build in not just the training that Leonie was talking about, but also the crews? Because presumably will you have to have, particularly as you talked, or does it not have its own crew? I haven't done fire for so long.
No additional crewing requirements.
There's no additional crewing, so it's not like a specialist fire appliance where you have a crew.
We've got 15 aerials now, and we'll continue to have 15.
So it just
it's a replacement programme. Yes.
Right. Sorry. It's a replacement programme, so you don't need additional. I just wondered whether you were going to need additional firefighters to be trained for this specialist piece of equipment, but you're just saying everyone gets trained in it and it becomes part of the core. That's fine. Okay, that's my fine knowledge of being out to date. Thank you.
Member DeVal.
Can you just update us? Have you exhausted all your conversations with government around any monies that they wish to allocate to you post-Grenfell? I understand there's a threshold issue in your cost. You don't quite meet those requirements. Have you therefore given up, or you continue to raise this with the... Is it Department of Communities and Local Government? Is there a special scheme? Or we had this all this morning about policing and all the rest of it. So what's it for fire?
So it would be the Bellwind scheme.
Yep.
And that would be DCLG, and our claim would go through with City Hall, but I think the threshold is still £750,000, even with the different threshold they put on for this particular year. And it's very specific about the cost. It's actually got a time window, so it wouldn't cover the things that we've talked about. It will be what are the immediate additional costs that you faced, and we can't get that up to £750,000.
Now, we heard this morning that the Home Office, a different department, you're dealing with communities and local government, will be much more flexible on giving some consideration to policing for some of the special grants and issues arising from the incidents that they faced last year. Is it a direct question to you then, Mr. Gallie? Where are we? We've given up the ghost, or are we pursuing?
Far from it. Although Sue says it's below the threshold, we have formally submitted the claim to CLG to pursue it, given the importance of the issues, and clearly we'll be lobbying hard, even though it doesn't meet the criteria, particularly mindful of what you heard this morning from the police. It feels like if the police are having some success, then there's no reason why fire should also not have that same criteria relaxed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
A couple of quick follow-ups on that, because that was quite an interesting exchange. Firstly, what was the cost of Grenfell?
What was the cost of Grenfell?
So in terms of, I mean, 750,000 is the threshold for the Bellwind scheme, and you said you couldn't quite get it up to 750,000. What cost have you estimated the cost of Grenfell as?
Well, it depends how you define what.
Using the Bellwind definitions.
With using the Bellwind definition, I think we've got up to about £380,000.
Okay. The second question is around why it is that you're dealing with the DCLG. Now, I realise this is a legacy issue, that DCLG, the Fire Brigade used to be answerable to the DCLG. However, you're not anymore. You're answerable to the Home Office, and the Minister is a Home Office Minister, Police and Fire. Is this just been something that civil servants have forgotten about, and they've just left the Bellwind scheme with the DCLG, or should it really be a Home Office scheme?
It's a local government scheme as well, which might have something to do with the confusion between the two, because obviously DCLG is still local government. I don't know if you know.
It's probably just a legacy of the transfer of the funding responsibilities from CLG to Home Office, and it's probably one that's gone down the cracks somewhere within government. It feels, again, we can exploit that.
I mean, I think given the flexibility that we heard about this morning in the police meeting, the flexibility that the Home Office are showing, I do think some leverage might be used to apply there, in this case as well.
As I said, I think we will be very keen to pursue that, mindful of what we heard this morning from MOPAC.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move on now and talk about the capital budget, and Assembly Member Prince is going to lead on that.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask, first of all, a couple of questions to Sue, please? The first question is, what was behind the decision to remove the £10 million asset management plan?
So we had a line in for £10 million to spend on, we called it the asset management plan, and it was to go over 4 years. And the intention was to reflect the investment that we know we need to make in our estate. We've got 102 fire stations in varying states of repair. And the asset management plan that we produced in March 17 set out the priorities for investment based on condition surveys, operational use, and all the rest of it. So we wanted to show a commitment to help to start addressing that. But we reviewed the capital programme, as we did everything else, as part of making this budget submission, and we looked at it alongside affordability, so how would we fund that investment? We looked at that line in particular because we didn't have specific schemes worked up that would show how that money would be spent. We also looked at deliverability. So some of the more ambitious things we'd like to do would be not rebuild on an existing constrained site, but actually find a new site and build something better nearby. And we also looked at the other projects that we've got on at the moment. So we're building a new training centre, we're moving our protective equipment group, we've got quite a lot of things on, and we looked at staff resourcing to deliver. And as a result of all that, we thought it was probably inappropriate to have a line in the capital programme that didn't have the detail behind it about how exactly it would be spent. Because by putting it in, it would have meant at this point that we'd have had to have shown the revenue cost of the borrowing to pay for it. So again, we'd have had a slightly inflated budget requirement as a consequence. So we decided to take it out and go back and say, right, we'll come back when we know an individual scheme that we've got, we know a timetable for it, we know it looks deliverable, then seek approval to do it in line with affordability at that time.
Right, so if I've understood what you've said correctly, although you believe you may have a £10 million capital expenditure, you may not after you reviewed it, but you may have, that potential expenditure is not shown in any of the budget lines at the moment.
No, so one of the other things that we took into account that probably ties into the earlier part of today's conversation was our history of our ability to spend our capital programme. So we have got a history of slippage and of costs in a good way coming in less than we expected. So as a result of that, it just seemed not the right thing, given the context of all the other budget pressures, to put in a line to spend money that wasn't precisely pinned down as exactly what we would do and when we would do it by.
But at some point, that could pop up.
So we would like to work up the schemes and bring them back. And we have got, I don't want to go into this. So we're trying to sell our old headquarters site down at 8 Albert Embankment, and we haven't at the moment factored in any capital receipt as a result of that development agreement. So that potentially would give us scope to invest back in our estate if that materialised.
Well, I won't ask you what you expect to get for that, because that's probably financially sensitive. Okay, it's an interesting accounting process, that, but okay. And you've answered my second question, which is when will it reappear? Well, of course, it will reappear when you've redefined it, I guess. Next question I have is, how do you intend to repay capital borrowing?
So the borrowing that we know that we need, based on our current assumptions around capital receipts and the spend that we've projected over the next 4 years, the borrowing costs of that, based on current PWL, Public Work Loan Board interest rates, that's all built in. So we can see that our interest costs will go up from a little under 10 million to a little over 12 million.
I've got it, I think. Is it page 30?
Yeah, potentially.
Is it?
Are you looking in this one?
Yeah. I haven't got the other one that you've got, you see. That's right.
Yes, you can see there our capital financing costs along the bottom. So they're all budgeted for. So all of the projections that we're talking about today, that includes the cost of our borrowing over that 4-year period.
But you have got some capital receipts, so I'm assuming that some of the capital expenditure will be offset by capital receipts.
Yeah, so this takes into account capital receipts that we know about.
This is a net figure,
there is still some uncertainty around that we've included, but it includes things that either have been delivered and there's still some residual money left to spend, or where there's reasonable certainty they will be delivered over the planning horizon.
I've got a diagram which you may not be party to, unfortunately, it's in my briefing, but it shows that in 2018 to 19, the vast majority of your capital borrowing will be covered by capital receipts, and then that tails off, and then in the final 2 years that I have here shows that the entirety will be funded through borrowing. So it's pretty much saying that after 1920, i.e. years 19 stroke 20, not 19, 20 years ago, the borrowing will, so you will have to fund your capital receipts by borrowing. There won't be any further capital receipts as such.
So that's from 2021 onwards.
Yeah. Okay. So, but it also says in this here that it includes PFI leases.
Yes.
So I was wondering what percentage of that would be PFI leases, as that's capitalised. If you haven't got the answer,
Or as a
perhaps you might let us know.
percentage, I haven't got, but PFI leases on our balance sheet are worth around £45 million.
45 million. Right, that doesn't quite add up with the diagram that I've got, but that's fine. In year 18-19 especially, but not quite the same in 19-20, but 18-19, it's looking as though on this diagram, which is diagrammatic, so it's not actual hard numbers, it looks like you'll be borrowing around about £2 million worth of capital, from what I can see. I'm guessing. I mean, you do have quite substantial reserves at the moment, if you want to call it that. And could you tell me what are your reserves as a percentage of your business?
We have earmarked reserves, including the budget flexibility reserve, and then we have the general reserve.
Yeah.
And it will be the general reserve that we talk about in percentage terms.
Yes.
So one of the things I'm required to do as statutory finance officer is say what the adequate minimum level of reserve is, and I say that should be 3.5%.
Right.
And that's based on an assessment of our risks, which we try and quantify, all that kind of thing.
And that is the figure, is it?
That's the figure that we're holding it at.
Right.
And then we've got the budget flexibility reserve, and then we've got a whole list of earmarked reserves set aside for specific things.
Because it just the size of the reserves is quite large, and but as you say, you have got most of it earmarked. It just struck me that it may not, or it might be prudent, to certainly in that first year, to use reserves to prevent borrowing, because obviously borrowing incurs a lot of ongoing costs, whereas reserves, yes, if you've got them on loan, then you get revenue from them, but ultimately usually one cancels out the other.
And that's something that we look at. So I think maybe last year we made a £3 million contribution to the capital programme on exactly that basis to help fund our fleet replacement. So that is something that we review on a regular basis.
Just out of interest, what sort of interest are you getting on? Do you do overnight, or do you?
So we go through the group investment syndicate. So that's sort of a shared service. So
we earn at the moment about just over 0.5%, about 0.5% on any balance.
Interest, yeah.
And as we talked earlier, the PWLB rate is going to be over 2.25%.
Exactly. So yeah. Then I had a long debate about this, but I won't go into that again. But clearly, if you can spend your reserves rather than lending it out, you actually save significantly more money.
Something that we'd like to look at as part of this investment syndicate, that we look across ourselves, the Met City Hall, and see how we can best use our spare balances.
I would like, though, because it's not clear on my diagram and I can't work it out on this, to try and understand a bit more about, not now, because I don't want to take one's time up, but just understand a little bit more in relation to where the PFI leases sit within the capital, and what is capital expenditure and what is PFI, and that I'd be quite grateful if I go something on that. Leave it at that, Chair.
Remember Barry?
Yeah, just same questions I've been asking all the different groups, really. There's capital receipts in the next year and the year after. This is the diagram we've just been referring to as well. It's £14.2 million in 2018-19, 26.7 million in 2019-20. Is it possible to get a list of which assets you are selling to get those capital receipts?
Certainly.
Does it already exist? So we can
yes, so it's tied into the station closures made as a result of the Fifth London Safety Plan, plus the disposal of our old headquarters, Tate, Albert and Bankman. So it's quite a small list, but I can write as part of the follow-up information with the details.
Yeah, if we can get a full list, that would be good, rather than when we surmise, because there might be just random bits and pieces as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Right, moving on to the final section now, in this whistle-stop tour through LFB's finances, and it's Assemblymember Pigeon leading on this.
Lovely. I want to pick up the fire service reform, so whether to the chair of LFEPA I could ask, I know there have been some technical issues that needed to be ironed out, so are we on target for this big change for the 1st of April?
Yes. We think we're on target for this sort of change to happen now.
But it's all ready to happen. So from the 1st of April, we will have the authority will be abolished and we'll have a statutory London Fire Commissioner. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's going to require implementation orders under the Police and Crime Act from last year, from 2017. And so there's going to need to be a statutory instrument laid which will amend the firefighters' pension scheme. But we've been consulted on both of these now, and we've had assurances that it is a priority and it will go ahead, and the Home Secretary will make the necessary property and staff transfer orders as well within the timescale.
So it all happen on the 1st. Sue, are there any financial implications from this change?
There's a saving that we've already accounted for in terms of members' allowances and the democratic services function that is provided for us by City Hall. We're expecting overall for the new arrangements to be a bit cheaper for us. We've set up a small reserve so we can test out what sort of things that we need to have in place and see what the best thing is before we put a permanent allocation in the budget for it. But for the moment, there's a £470,000 saving from those two items I mentioned.
Okay. And Steve, can I ask you, obviously this is quite a big change, will it help the operational effectiveness of the fire brigade?
Yes, I think it will, but when we talk about operational effectiveness, I think we're talking about the whole organisation as London Fire Brigade, not least of all just speeding up decision making will assist the effectiveness of the organisation going forward.
Okay. And have you looked at, obviously we've had the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime established for a few years, and they've had some issues as well as possibly some positive things. What have you learnt? Have you been looking at their structure? Have you been looking at that to make sure that you learn from perhaps some of the mistakes they made early on?
I think it's important to recognise we're not having a duplicate model. So I think we have been looking at things around transparency, which came up at this meeting last year, just to make sure that it doesn't sort of become an issue. So I think one of the things that we'll be looking at making sure happens is that we still get the information that comes to members of the authority and members of the Assembly now, both around sort of spending decisions, policy decisions, but also around some of the information members get at the moment about fatal fires and the causes of fatal fires. We'll make sure that is still available, but I think Sue can go into a bit more of the technical detail about how that will happen. Possibly. She's looking at me.
Sue's looking slightly worried there.
It's transparent.
Yeah.
Point. So we want to make sure that the committee gets the Assembly gets a similar sort of information that it's currently got. We also want to make sure that commissioners' decisions are published and also that all the mayoral decisions are published. So as officers, we're assuming similar levels of information requirements, similar sort of timelines for making sure information is released, but the decisions that we want to take are where they can be and made public before they're taken, all that kind of thing. So we're working under a similar type of regime, but not within a committee structure. So it's just understanding how that will all work and where the separation is between the London Fire Commissioner's decisions and the decisions that the Deputy Mayor or Mayor would take, and how those two processes would fit together.
Member Cooper.
This came up last year, and obviously there's been slightly more time to think about it than probably was anticipated. But a concern that was expressed was when the transfer took place from the MPA to MOPAC, that some records and useful information was lost. So as well as transparency, I wondered if attention, particularly given there's been this additional time available, has been paid to the need for maintaining records and bringing data over, as well as the obvious things about the change in the way the committees work. And obviously I assume that some of the stuff about the confidential arrangements would just be covered by the exclusion of the public that we do at some of the committees that we have in any case. But for me, the important thing is about making sure that we don't lose anything.
That would be important for us because we use a lot of this information for our own record keeping. So the intention would be that it remains available so we can look back and remind ourselves what we asked and told you before in the same way that you would want to look back. So.
I think that's really important that we do make sure that happens. And it's very welcome to hear that the transparency will continue, because just to pay the Fire Brigade a compliment, I actually think the information that we get as Assembly members about important issues that are coming up in the Fire Brigade is better and more regular and more frequent than the information that we get from MOPAC and the information that we get from, dare I say, TfL. Not that I would want to know every time someone, walks across a zebra crossing in London, which obviously TfL could probably supply with their endless amount of data, but I think somehow the Fire Brigade has got that balance right, and I think perhaps some lessons could be learnt elsewhere.
Yes, in that area, as in many others. All I can say in closing is that on the issue of fire service reform, as a former chairman, in answer to the question, would it improve operational effectiveness, all I can say is I'm extremely jealous that it's happening after my time and not while I was still in the seat. Unless any other member has anything else, okay, we are now at the end of the meeting. Members, can we note the questions asked and the answers given? I'd like to thank our guests for giving up their time this afternoon. Just a couple of items of business to close the meeting. Item 4, the Budget Performance Committee Work Programme, which we've noted twice already today. Would you like to note it for a third time?
Yes.
Date of the next meeting, fortunately, is not this afternoon. It's next Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning here. There is no any other urgent business, so the meeting is closed.
Happy days.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber, Sound.